Now on BBC One The News with Darren Jordan. It's 10 o'clock.
Drawing the battle lines, deciding the future of Britain's EU rebate. Jack Straw says the entire budget needs reworking.
It will fail to deliver the jobs and economic growth needed in Europe. It's wasteful and it is unfair.
Fighting poverty in Africa, Tony Blair arrives in Moscow to get Russian support. British troops arrest Iraqi insurgents suspected of killing 2 young soldiers. And how Button's brush with a wall put him out of the Canadian Grand Prix. Good evening. The war of words over the European Union's financial future intensified tonight. Within minutes of arriving for talks in Luxembourg, the Foreign Secretary Jack Straw attacked the EU budget as wasteful and unfair. And he promised to veto any attempt by the rest of Europe to scrap Britain's £3.5 billion rebate. Our Europe editor Mark Mardell reports.
The Foreign Secretary walked into the room knowing he faced an ambush. Every other foreign minister, however friendly face-to-face, is demanding Britain should give up its rebate, the cheque the UK gets back from the European Union. So he attacked first, savaging the way the EU spends its money, arguing it hurts the poor of Africa and of Europe and doesn't help create jobs.
The proposed budget is not fit for purpose. It will fail to deliver the jobs and economic growth needed in Europe. It's wasteful and it is unfair.
To be fair, should we give up our rebate then so it can be spent on the poorer countries?
Look, if we abandoned our rebate, which we're not going to, none of Europe's fundamental problems would be solved. The rebate is not the issue. The rebate is simply a symptom of a much bigger problem, namely the structure of this budget.
This is what he's talking about. Relatively rich countries in the European Union still get big money for their farmers. The Common Agricultural Policy was invented in the 1950s when there were worries people were leaving the land for towns and those who remained would be stuck in poverty. Decades later, the EU still spends nearly half its budget, 46%, on farming subsidies, even though only 5% of its people work on the land. France gets the biggest slice of that money, 23%. Spain's next with 14%, Britain gets 9%. The President of the European Commission is here in Luxembourg to listen, to hear what they think of his budget. But the Commission sees itself as the guardian of the best interests of the EU as a whole, and he's also willing to urge Britain to make sacrifices.
Britain is much more rich. There are countries now, 10 new countries that are poorer, much poorer. It will not be fair for them to support proportionally more of the burden than Britain.
The foreign ministers are meeting next to a building that has a curious resemblance to a padded cell. These are just the opening shots in the budget negotiations. And before they're over, the ministers may be calling for straitjackets as well.
Mark, we understand the talks have just broken up. Any move forward?
No, not at all. The Foreign Secretary came here expecting an argument rather than an agreement, and that's exactly what he got. So it's broken up without any solution. We didn't really expect one tonight. This was more ministers setting out their position. But the worrying thing for Britain is that not one of the other 24 foreign ministers supported Britain.
And it's significant, isn't it, Mark? Jack Straw had some very strong words.
It was extremely strong, tough language. He didn't mention the French by name, but that's what he meant. And the British position is this, that if they're going to talk about the rebate, then we've got to talk about the reason that Britain gets a rebate, and that it was that the French farmers in particular get their pockets stuffed with gold and we don't get much of that money back. But beyond that, there's another purpose. After the French no, after the French referendum, Tony Blair said he wanted a big debate about the economic future of Europe, and that's what they're trying to kickstart now.
All right, Mark, thank you. Tony Blair has arrived in Moscow to try to win Russia's backing for plans to combat poverty in Africa and global warming. It's his first stop on a tour of Europe ahead of next month's G8 summit. Well, our political correspondent, John Pienaar, has been travelling with the Prime Minister. He joins us now from Moscow. John, what's Tony Blair hoping to achieve from this trip to Moscow?
Well, he's got a lot on, Darren. It'll certainly be hectic. 4 countries in 2 days, starting in Moscow. And what Tony Blair wants to do is some more groundwork ahead of the G8 summit of advanced countries next month in Scotland. So he's got a deal in place ready to seal on African aid and on global warming. Now, Russia takes over the chair of the G8 at the end of the year, and what Tony Blair wants is to have a deal ready to hand over so President Putin of Russia can carry on where he picks up. But leaves off. But after Russia, it's then Berlin, then it's Paris. And with this European row in the air, well, things are looking, it looks as if they're going to get trickier as time goes on.
Yeah, John, you say after this he goes on to Germany and France. What sort of reception can he expect there?
Well, it will be difficult, I think, on the face of things so far. Both the German leader and the French leader are attacking the British rebate, as we've been hearing, and that looks like being wound up in the whole argument about the European Constitution, with Mr. Blair under more and more pressure not to be the one who finally pulls the plug on that Constitution. And arguably, from one point of view, it suits those leaders.